By the 18th century, the chasm between the scientific development of Western Europe and the intellectual tradition of the Ottoman Empire had become undeniably wide. While the West was experiencing the Enlightenment and the rapid acceleration of the scientific revolution, the dominant educational institutions within the empire, primarily the madrasas, remained rigorously focused on classical Islamic jurisprudence, theology, and philosophy. The core question facing Ottoman leadership was stark. How do you modernize your military and administration to compete with European rivals without fundamentally undermining the traditional social and religious foundations of the state? This dilemma created an intense internal friction, polarizing the elite between those who saw Western science as a pragmatic tool for survival and those who viewed it as a corrosive, secular threat to the established order, ultimately laying the groundwork for official resistance to intellectual imports. The primary agent of intellectual conservatism was the ulema, the powerful scholarly and religious hierarchy. They held immense sway over judicial and educational matters. For the ulema, the importation of Western scientific texts, especially those relating to astronomy, physics, or philosophy, was not merely a technical adjustment, but a potential ideological contamination. Concepts like heliocentrism, advanced by figures such as Copernicus and Galileo, directly contradicted certain orthodox interpretations of cosmic order long enshrined in Ottoman tradition. This fear wasn't irrational. It was a defense mechanism designed to protect cultural sovereignty and the ulema's institutional power base. They effectively framed Western knowledge as bid'ah, or dangerous innovation, arguing that true and sufficient knowledge already resided within the Islamic framework, making secular European texts superfluous at best and heretical at worst.
The ban was rarely an absolute codified decree applied universally across the empire. Rather, it manifested as pervasive institutional reluctance and active censorship, particularly targeting the mainstream public school system. While military engineering schools, established to rapidly improve naval and artillery capabilities, were reluctantly permitted to use translated technical manuals, focusing purely on utility without philosophical context, general education remained strictly controlled. Textbooks covering modern mathematics, geography, biology, and especially political science were systematically removed or forbidden from circulation in non-specialized institutions. This created a dual system where military elites possessed limited, highly specific technical competence, yet the vast majority of the intellectual class and the bureaucracy were deliberately shielded from the foundational scientific and philosophical thought driving European success, ensuring intellectual stagnation outside immediate defense needs.
The immediate and profound effect of this intellectual blockade was the widening of the technological gap, which quickly became an economic and geopolitical crisis. The ban ensured the Ottoman Empire essentially missed the boat on the early phases of the Industrial Revolution. Scientific knowledge is cumulative. Without open access to European theories on mechanics, chemistry, and resource extraction, the empire lacked the foundational human capital necessary for industrialization. While the central government could purchase modern machinery or weapon systems, they couldn't produce, maintain, or innovate upon them domestically. This dependence on foreign technical expertise eroded financial stability and severely compromised strategic autonomy, turning the Ottoman state from dominant power into an increasingly vulnerable client state, reliant on European technology and loans for survival.
Furthermore, the ban fostered a dangerous intellectual schism within the Ottoman elite itself. Those few who were exposed to Western thought, often through private tutors, diplomatic missions, or specialized military training, began to view the ulema and the traditional bureaucracy with contempt, seeing them as the root cause of the empire's decline. Instead of forming a cohesive group dedicated to integrated modernization, these factions spent critical decades battling over the legitimacy of their respective knowledge systems. This lack of ideological consensus paralyzed meaningful reform initiatives, ensuring that even when progressive sultans like Mahmud II attempted sweeping changes, they faced ingrained internal sabotage rooted in intellectual mistrust.
The suppression of scientific inquiry also had deeply detrimental effects on fields seemingly unrelated to military science, such as medicine and public health. European medical advances in germ theory, sanitation, and pharmacology were slow to be adopted because the underlying biological and chemical texts explaining these principles were viewed with suspicion. This contributed significantly to the devastating frequency of major epidemics, cholera, plague, smallpox, that swept through Ottoman cities throughout the 19th century, decimating the population and crippling the economy. While some forward-thinking medical schools did eventually integrate Western methods, their impact was localized and often met resistance from traditional healers and religious leaders who continued to advocate faith-based or outdated humoral treatments, further illustrating the severe real-world consequences of intellectual isolation. Despite the prevailing atmosphere of censorship, Western ideas were far from completely blocked. They often entered the empire through unofficial channels: private publishing houses, translation bureaus established under reforming pashas, and, importantly, through the foreign missionary schools operating within Ottoman territories. These translation bureaus became critical, clandestine pathways for intellectual exchange, allowing individuals to secretly access works by Newton, Voltaire, Rousseau, and Diderot. These texts, translated initially for a small intellectual elite, slowly poisoned the well of traditional thought, fostering a revolutionary intellectual environment. This underground knowledge network laid the foundation for the Young Turk movement and the later push for constitutionalism, proving that while books could be banned from official shelves, ideas, once translated, could not be truly contained. The struggle reached its height during the Tanzimat period in the mid-19th century. Reform-minded statesmen recognized that systemic modernization required shifting educational priorities away from purely religious doctrine towards practical skills and modern science. They attempted to establish entirely new secular state schools, mekteps, separate from the traditional madrasa system. However, the ulama fiercely resisted these attempts to usurp their educational monopoly. They leveraged their traditional influence over the populace to discourage attendance at the new schools, branding them as centers of impious learning. This resulted in a fragmented educational landscape that failed to produce the universally competent, modern workforce the empire desperately needed. The continuous push and pull between state reformers and religious conservatives ensured that educational modernization remained slow, inconsistent, and ultimately insufficient to halt the empire's overall decline. This prolonged period of intellectual suppression deeply affected the long-term culture of innovation within the Ottoman lands. When scientific knowledge is restricted, it breeds a culture of rote learning, obedience to tradition, and a deep suspicion of empiricism and experimentation. Future generations of Ottoman scientists, engineers, and thinkers lacked the philosophical framework that underpinned Western scientific method, the rigorous questioning of assumptions, the emphasis on observation, and the spirit of constant revision. This deficiency was arguably more damaging than the lack of specific textbooks. The ban didn't just prevent the reading of certain books, it stifled the development of a scientific mindset necessary for creating an indigenous, self-sustaining tradition of inquiry and technological development. The consequences of restricting scientific education extended into the political sphere, significantly contributing to the ideological volatility of the early 20th century. By failing to integrate modernity smoothly, the empire fostered extremist reactions. The modernists, having been forced to seek knowledge outside the official system, often adopted a highly secular and fiercely nationalistic stance, believing that only the total rejection of the old restrictive order could save the state. This polarization ultimately fueled the intense radicalism of the Committee of Union and Progress, or CUP, and the Young Turk Revolution, which saw the elimination of the Sultanate and the eventual creation of the secular Turkish Republic. The inability to reconcile traditional learning with modern science created a conflict that could only be resolved through complete rupture, highlighting the destructive power of prolonged intellectual stagnation and censorship. Looking back, the ban on Western scientific books in Ottoman schools represents a critical turning point where cultural defense mechanisms fatally undermined national survival. It illustrates a perennial conflict in rapidly globalizing societies, the difficulty of adopting pragmatic foreign knowledge without sacrificing core identity. While the ulema sought to protect the religious integrity of the empire, the unintended consequence was systemic educational failure, a catastrophic loss of technological competitiveness, and the eventual violent fragmentation of the state. It serves as a powerful historical lesson that intellectual curiosity, open inquiry, and the embrace of knowledge, even uncomfortable knowledge, are essential prerequisites for long-term stability and strength, proving that often the greatest threat to a civilization is self-imposed ignorance.
The legacy of this educational struggle continues to echo today, informing debates on secularism and education in many parts of the Middle East. Understanding the forces that led a once mighty empire to turn away from pivotal scientific advancement provides essential context for the modernization challenges still faced by successor states. Thank you for delving into this complex history with us. If you found this analysis insightful and want more deep dives into the historical forces that shaped our modern world, please take a moment to engage with our channel. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more updates. Your support helps us continue to uncover these crucial historical narratives.